Welcome to Scandinavia House Online. I'm Ed Gallagher, president of the American-Scandinavian Foundation and Scandinavia House, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our first interactive digital exhibition, Conversations with a Shipwreck. In this multimedia meditation on the legendary Swedish warship Vasa, which sank only minutes into her maiden voyage in 1628, ASF fellows Joan Wickersham and Adam Davies explore themes of memory and oblivion, permanence and impermanence, and mortality and time through presentations of poems, large format photographs, and short durational audio and video. In this unique interactive platform available through June 5th, viewers are able to experience a series of video pairings between Davies' photographs and Wickersham's prose poems, while also exploring the history of the Vasa. This exhibition also highlights the ASF Fellowships and Grant Program, which demonstrates the Foundation's long-standing commitment to educational and cultural exchange. Since its founding in 1910, ASF has given more than 7,500 fellowships and grants to Americans and Nordic scholars, students, and artists to pursue their work abroad, awarding over $800,000 in the past year. Thank you for visiting Scandinavia House Online and enjoy the exhibition.
Hi, I'm Darcy Frey, and I'm here with writer Joan Wickersham and photographer Adam Davies, who collaborated on this project, Conversations with a Shipwreck. I have questions for both of them, and very glad that you could join us. I'm very curious to hear about the beginnings of this project. Could you tell us a little bit about how it originally came about and what sparked the idea for it?
Well, my husband, Jay, had read about the Vasa in an issue of National Geographic when he was 6 years old. This was in the early 60s, at the time when the ship had been rediscovered at the bottom of Stockholm Harbor. And so when he and I visited Stockholm on a vacation in 2013, he really wanted to go and see the Vasa Museum. You walk through 3 sets of double doors, and suddenly you're standing there in this dark, gloomy space the size of a hockey rink. And there is this massive ship just coming at you out of the gloom. And it's huge, it's mysterious, it's not like anything I had ever seen before. And I just fell in love with it unexpectedly. I just was so moved by it in a way that I couldn't even understand. It felt to me as if I had accidentally wandered into this secret space where a mythological creature was hiding. And it just had this power. When we got back to the United States, I just started to write these pieces that were evoked in some way by the ship. It stirred me, and the ship made the decision for me. I don't think I particularly made the decision.
One of the things that's very striking to me, I know you as a prose writer, a writer of prose fiction and nonfiction, and what you've written here is poetry. And you've said to me that it kind of naturally came out with the density and compression of poetry. And I'm curious if you have a sense as to why that happened.
When I think of narrative, I think of first this happens, then that happens, then this happens, then that happens. There's a kind of sequence of chronology and also of consequence. This happens because that happened. And I think what I felt when I saw the ship was that everything was compressed into one object. We were seeing the object in present time, and yet the past of the object was right there as well. And even the future of the object was there too, because they are constantly having to deal with how to preserve the Vasa. That's an ongoing challenge. Maybe that is why I instinctively went for these compressed pieces, which are unlike anything I've ever written before.
So how did the collaboration with Adam come about?
I was writing these pieces for 4 or 5 years. And then I teach in the summer at the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown, and Adam teaches there too. And I had never met him, but he gave a presentation of his work one night. And I was so blown away by his photographs that I just suddenly thought, I wonder what he would do with the Vasa. I just suddenly got the idea of not only would I love to have images with this project, which I had never thought of before, but I'd love Adam's images. I wanted to see what Adam's eye would do with this.
I think I remember we had a coffee on a Thursday or Friday of that week, and I think it was a mutual admiration sort of situation. And the whole way that she described it, it seemed like an adventure that sort of made sense to me somehow. And the language and the pieces that she had read that I was familiar with clicked with ideas and emotions that I sort of was interested in exploring visually. And so that's how it started. We went to Stockholm for a 1-week trip to explore, and I took my camera and took a few pictures. That convinced me that there was something there that I could photograph. And it was very much one of these processes where I think each of us was doing a little bit and the other person was responding to it and going in a different direction that led to a new idea that sort of pushed the project further and further.
When I invited Adam to work with me on the project, I was responding to, first of all, the beauty of his photographs. They're vast in what they're taking in, and they're monumental in scale, but they're also incredibly precise about very, very small objects and small details. The level of what you can perceive in that photograph is very, very fine. So I think I was responding to that, and also just his emotional eye. I remember the first time I walked into the museum with Adam. It was such a weird experience because I had walked into the museum for the first time not expecting anything and being swept off my feet by this ship unexpectedly, whereas Adam was brought to the museum by this person who was already crazy about this ship, and he stood there and I stood there next to him, and his job was to fall in love with it. And I just think that is a really different circumstance. And it was it was a weird moment. It was a weird few hours. It was a weird few days. What I loved was that he found his own way to the ship, even under all that pressure.
It's strange. I think for Joan it was difficult because you're sharing something that you really love, and that's a very vulnerable place to be in. And for me, as somehow I'd already accepted that I was going to try to make it work, and so it was more the pressure of trying to figure out how to do justice to the words and to the writing. And something that attracted me to Joan's work in particular is her precision in her writing, and her precision in her language, and the way that sentences seem to fall, just have a rhythm to it, have a rhythm to the language. And for me, that's really important in photographs as well, this sense that everything has importance, everything has meaning.
So when you Adam, when you first went into the museum, visually, did it look as though you thought it would? And if it did or didn't, what was it about the museum and the ship that stirred your visual imagination?
The museum is a very special museum in terms of the architecture was built around the ship itself, and everything is serving viewing the ship. And to me, it almost felt like a tomb, to be inside a tomb in a strange way. That there's this object that is very dark because it's almost black wood, and that is sort of resting inside this concrete construction that people sort of file around. And all of those things, I mean, I think I'm very interested in architecture, I'm very interested in structure, and there was a lot of elements there that played off of things that I'm interested in, but it was very new to me as well because it's much more of an interior space. The building was one of the biggest challenges, but it also provided a nice contrast in the sense that it was a goal to break the hold the building had on the ship, if that makes sense. The architects who had designed that building had done such a intense and strong job of trying to craft people's viewpoints of the ship that I was always looking for a way to subvert it or to break it and to see it from a different point of view, a different angle.
I would imagine that technically shooting inside the space must have thrown up all sorts of challenges and obstacles. Be curious to hear what some of those were and how you got around them.
The thing that I considered the biggest issue initially was that the museum was lighting the boat like it was a museum object. And so to photograph it would photograph it in a way that felt very much like it was this object on display. And what I wanted to capture in the photographs was something else, something a little bit more emotional and evocative, and sort of this object appearing out of darkness was really the idea that I had in my head when I was starting out. And to do that meant that we had to work with the museum to change the lighting, or in this case specifically turn off all the lighting and use natural light that was coming into the museum instead. And the second problem with the ship, if you call it a problem, is that the way that they preserved it was that they infused the wood with wax. So when they pulled it out of the water that was in the wood itself would dry out, and that would make the ship too fragile. So they replaced that with wax. But the process of doing that meant that the ship was very glossy and very shiny. And so you had all these hot spots with all these spotlights on it. And this was, so if you were to photograph it in normal lighting conditions in the museum, it would have all this glare shooting off of it. And I really wanted to reduce the feel of that waxiness and get back to the quality of the wood itself.
One of the interesting things about the images is the incredible depth of focus that you seem to achieve. Foreground and background seem almost equally precise. And I wonder if you could speak about that a little bit, how you achieve that effect.
Yeah, so the way to achieve it is by playing with the aperture. So the aperture is how much, the hole in which the light comes through, basically on a camera. The smaller it is, a pinhole, for example, has almost infinite depth of field, so that you have that quality. So the smaller the hole also means the less light that's coming into the camera, which means a longer exposure. So all these pictures were done on a tripod, and I think the shortest exposure was probably half a minute or so. The longest exposure was 45 minutes or 50 minutes. So it's a very slow process, and using a very small aperture and to try to get that depth of field. And that's something that I do in a lot of my work. Something that I'm interested in is this idea of depth in a picture. So instead of expansiveness, it's more about going deep into the picture frame. I should say that these were all shot on film. So these are done on large format film negatives, and then they were scanned and printed digitally.
So Joan, it seems as though the ship provided a setting, the story of the ship provided a situation, almost a vocabulary for you to work with, but what you've written here spokes out from the story of the ship in all sorts of unexpected directions. And I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about that.
I think what excited me about the ship was that it embodies a whole set of paradoxes. And the first one is that it shouldn't have survived. It was built to be a warship. And so what it should have done is it should have gone out from the harbor, out into the ocean, and it should have fought in battles, and it would have either been burned, or it would have been sunk, or it would have been wrecked on some rocks, or it would have had a career as a warship, which doesn't end well. So it would have just been lost, and we wouldn't have heard of it. So the only reason it was there at all was that it was a colossal failure. It was a fiasco. It didn't do its job, and its job was to get lost and get forgotten. I think I was at a point in my life where I was trying to reckon with my own failures and my own senses of what had gone well and what hadn't gone well. And I think I was starting to really see the shape of my own life, and really start to recognize my own mortality. My parents had both died, and I was at that point where I was starting to understand, not only intellectually but viscerally, that this is going to happen to me too. There was something about the ship and its paradoxes that I found inexpressibly moving.
The work explodes outwards, almost prismatically in all sorts of different directions. You inhabit, Joan, you inhabit the mind, or you speak in conversation to the widow of the shipbuilder. You speak to the shipworm, one figure who survived the wreck, one who didn't. You found your way imaginatively into all sorts of different portals. I'd be curious to hear you talk about how that took shape.
The ship itself is almost like a frozen, it's like one of those moments in a fairy tale where an enchanter just freezes the scene. And so the people are sitting with the food on the plate and someone is in the act of spinning on a spinning wheel. You know, it felt like it was this incredibly human set of things that were accidentally caught in a moment of time. The scale of the objects that were found with the ship are pitiful. And I don't mean by that they're pathetic or something like that, but they're you recognize them as your own things, you know, a sewing kit, a game board, a clock, a button. You know, it's just, they're these small human things. The story was a big historical story, but it also was this small story of, you know, the possessions we have and the things we treasure, and then also this kind of helplessness of being caught by some unexpected tragedy, and then whatever is around you is what's around you. Something about these visits to Stockholm unlocked a lot of the feelings that I had about my mother's death. She was very suddenly paralyzed and she had to go to a hospital and then eventually to a nursing home, and she never got to go back to her house. And so I would go into that house, and what was there was just whatever had been there at that moment when this happened to her. So I think when you see something that really stirs you, the way that museum stirred me, part of what it does is stir up your personal associations.
But there's such originality and daring in both the literary and the visual components of the project. I'm curious to know, from the work that you've each done previously, was it similar to, was it a great departure from the work that you'd each done?
Well, for me, the two previous books I had done, one is The Suicide Index, which is a memoir of my father's suicide and what led up to it and the impact that it had on our family. And that book was structured in the form of an index. And I worked on that book for a long time, for really a decade before I arrived at the index structure. But once I found that index structure, it really told me how to tell the story. So that was a very structured book about some very messy material. The next book was called The News from Spain, and that's fiction, and it is 7 complicated, messy, unconventional love stories, each of which is called The News from Spain, but the title means something very different in each story. So that was also a very highly structured book about a very messy subject. The index was the spine of the memoir, and the idea of the stories all having the same title was the spine of The News from Spain. For me, the ship itself is the spine of this project and gives it a kind of place from which it can go shooting off in all directions.
The previous work that I've been doing for about 5 years that Joan had seen was work that was mainly around bridges and tunnels, different types of infrastructure. And at first I was interested in how these structures changed the landscape and also were being absorbed by the landscape. And then increasingly I got interested in the way that people were using that space, the subculture that sort of existed in these spaces. And I think in general, my interest is in these sort of delicate subversions of space, or the way that you create an object, and it very much applies to the Vasa, where the intent is to do one thing and it starts to take on other meanings. And as it's being used, it starts to be used in different ways that are unexpected and are not prepared for. And the Vasa itself, we know, was designed to be a warship, but it never actually functioned in that role. It became a historical monument, it became a story, it became a legend, but it deviated very quickly from the original path of what it was. So I think in that way, there's overlap between what I was previously doing and what this is. One of the early ideas and images that I had in my head, and it wasn't even something I saw, but it was an idea, was the feeling of the divers who had found the Vasa again for the first time. And it's described in the museum and it's described in books as being so filled with mud that they could barely see it. And it was just, they were touching it and trying to find objects, but they try to find the boat by touching rather than by seeing. And that really stuck with me, and as a way of trying to create an image.
The 17th century had this convention of vanitas paintings where they would paint a skull on a table with a candle. And the idea is of mortality and transience, that you were supposed to contemplate the skull and think, as I am now, I will one day be that skull, and that skull was once a human being, and nobody avoids that. It's inevitable. And I think for me, the ship became that kind of object of a kind of a that all of the cycles of being built, having a mission, failing in the mission, being somehow resurrected, and now deteriorating again, that there was something that I was contemplating in that object. And I think in a way it's not a coincidence that a 17th century object would evoke a kind of a 17th century response in me, even though I wasn't consciously thinking about that at all at the time. Adam, when you said early on in this interview that you felt you were walking into a tomb, it does have a really sobering effect when you walk in there. It's the darkness, but I think it's also the knowledge of everything that the ship has been through.
How many trips did you actually take?
Yeah, I started going in 2013, and I was going every year, sometimes twice a year. We went together briefly in the fall of 2018, but we both knew that in order to do this, we would need to be together in Stockholm for a sustained period of time. So that was made possible by a grant that we got from the American-Scandinavian Foundation, and that's what enabled us to be together in Stockholm for a month. We couldn't have done this without that.
It was important to sort of understand the city of Stockholm because the boat is so tied to that city as well. And so in different ways, we were trying to try to break the story out of the museum itself and into the larger context of that city.
There's one photograph that is taken from the cliffs up above the part of the harbor where the ship went down. And when you stand on that cliff, you can actually see from that one spot, you can see where the ship was built, where it was launched, where it sank, where you can look across to the dry dock that it was hauled to when it was found, and you can actually see the Vasa Museum from that spot. So the geography of Stockholm is actually incredibly eloquent when you're seeking to understand the Vasa story. When I first started going to the museum, I was just, lurking. I was just in there as a museum visitor with a notebook, and that went on for some years. But when Adam joined the project, there was no way we could furtively take photographs in there with a 40-minute exposure. So we had to introduce ourselves to the museum and hope that they were going to be receptive to this project. And they were so nice. They were so welcoming of us. They were so gracious in giving us access. They gave us access to the archives and the storage rooms. They opened drawers and cabinets and showed us objects that were not on public display. We got to go on the ship, which ordinarily visitors can't do. We got to go down inside the ship.
I wouldn't have been able to do any of the photographs without the help of the museum. It would have been impossible to photograph while there were visitors in that space. So all the photographs were done outside of museum hours, were done by having spaces made available or places available, like the dry dock, for example. The curator called in advance to let us into that space. That's a working dry dock otherwise. It helped give another context and make the ship more present in the modern day in a way by talking to all the people who work there. And so it really tied it back to the city, the present day as well. And I think that's what Joan does so beautifully in her writing, is that it drifts between times, between the present, the past, her personal past, and sort of the historical past in very sort of eloquent and strange ways. And that just having that access to the museum and having access to the people who work there added another layer to that, I think, in a really nice way.
Yeah, thank you both. It's been a fascinating conversation. It's been great to talk to both of you.
Thank you, Darcy.
Thank you. Yeah, very nice to meet you.